Picture this. You're floating alone in open water, miles from shore, and something large moves beneath you in the dark blue. Your heart does that thing where it forgets how to beat normally. And then, out of nowhere, a pod of dolphins surrounds you, circling, pressing close, refusing to let whatever is down there get any nearer. Here's the strange part. Why would a wild animal ever treat you, a completely different species, as something worth protecting at all? Marine researchers who study these encounters have logged case after case of it happening, in different oceans. Decades apart, none of the pods ever having contact with each other. Feel that water around you for a second. Feel how cold it gets when you can't see what's underneath you, how your own splashing suddenly sounds too loud. Nature usually doesn't work this way. Survival is supposed to be selfish. An animal is supposed to protect its own genes, its own pod, maybe its own species at a stretch. It is not supposed to spend energy, take on danger, and put itself between a predator and a stranger from another species entirely. And yet, again and again, something in that dolphin's head appears to make a mistake, one that just happens to save a human life. Ask yourself honestly, would you risk yourself the same way for a stranger species in the water? What's actually happening inside that mistake is stranger than the heroism people usually assume. What actually happens in these encounters follows a pattern that shows up again and again in eyewitness accounts and the handful of cases marine biologists have studied closely. The dolphins don't usually attack the shark outright. Instead, they form a tight, moving barrier, nudging the human toward the surface or toward shore, using their bodies as a wall. Sometimes it's a single dolphin. Often it's several, working almost like they've rehearsed it, though no one has ever caught them rehearsing anything. Lifeguards and divers who've lived through it describe the same details independently. The tightening circle, the nudging, the refusal to let the group drift apart. If you made it this far, you already know this channel goes deeper than the surface explanation, so if that's the kind of thing you like, sticking around and subscribing means you won't miss where this one is headed. Here's a direct question for you. If a dolphin can read distress in a species that isn't even close to its own, what does that say about how differently it might be seeing us the whole time? Scientists are still cautious about calling this proof of anything specific, and that caution is exactly where the real mystery starts. There isn't one single agreed answer here, and it's worth being honest about that before going further. Researchers have floated a handful of competing ideas. Some think it's simple curiosity, dolphins investigating a strange, splashing shape in the water. Others point to mobbing behavior, the same instinct that makes dolphins gang up on sharks entering their territory regardless of whether a human happens to be nearby. Some suspect a form of learned behavior, passed down through pods that have simply had lucky, repeated exposure to swimmers. But the leading hypothesis, the one with the most support behind it, comes from something called alloparenting. In dolphin pods, adults regularly care for calves that are not their own offspring, protecting injured or disoriented members of the group without pausing to check how closely related they are. It isn't a calculated decision. It behaves more like a reflex, triggered by a very specific signal: struggle, distress, disorientation, near the surface in water. This is not the same thing as human empathy, and dolphins are almost certainly not consciously choosing to be heroic the way a person might. What seems to happen instead is that the sight and sound of struggle pulls a response that evolved to protect the pod. And that response may simply not come with a built-in filter for species. A struggling human swimmer can produce distress cues close enough to a struggling calf's that the switch fires anyway. Ask yourself this: what if the kindness we assume is aimed at us is really a switch that was never built to tell the difference? That's one compelling explanation, not a proven fact, but it's the one that best fits everything researchers have observed so far. And there's an older story that puts this exact idea to the test, one stranger than any modern encounter. Go back to 2004 off the coast of New Zealand. Marine biologist Rob Howes was swimming with 3 companions, including his own daughter, when a pod of dolphins suddenly surrounded the group, pushing them into a tight formation and refusing to let anyone drift apart. Howes said the dolphins were behaving strangely, agitated, circling faster than usual. Minutes later, a great white shark appeared just beneath the surface, close enough to see clearly. The dolphins held their position for 40 minutes until it finally moved off. It's a striking account, but it isn't alone. Divers off the coast of Egypt's Red Sea have described a near-identical pattern. Dolphins tightening a circle around a swimmer the moment a shark drifted into view, then dispersing calmly once it left. Different ocean, different pod, same behavior. Think back to that open water from before, that cold, exposed feeling of not knowing what's underneath you. If accounts like these pull you in, it helps the channel more than you'd think to hit subscribe and drop a comment on what you would have done in that water, because that kind of reaction says a lot about how we actually process fear. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. If this instinct is real and consistent, why doesn't it happen every single time a shark is nearby? That question has an answer, and it's not the one most people expect. The truth is, this protective behavior does not happen in every encounter, and understanding the exceptions tells you more than the rule itself. First, pod size matters enormously. A lone dolphin rarely engages in this kind of extended protective circling, since the behavior depends on group coordination that a single animal simply cannot sustain against a large predator. Second, species and region matter. Bottlenose dolphins in warmer coastal waters are documented far more often in these encounters than other dolphin species, likely because their social structures are unusually tight-knit, and their pods spend more time near human swimmers in the first place. Third, and this one surprises people, dolphins have also been observed mobbing sharks aggressively, ramming them with their snouts rather than simply forming a passive barrier, which suggests the response isn't one fixed behavior, but a flexible reaction shaped by the specific threat in front of them. It's a bit like a group of strangers reacting to a fire alarm. Some will calmly usher people out the door, others will physically block the exit from the danger itself. Same instinct, different expression. Ask yourself which version you'd expect from an animal supposedly acting on pure instinct alone. None of this makes the behavior less real, it makes it more precise, more calculated in its own animal way, and that precision hints at something even stranger, buried in dolphin social life. Dolphins are, socially, far closer to humans than most people give them credit for, and this is where the story gets genuinely strange. Within a pod, dolphins maintain what researchers call signature whistles, essentially individual names that other dolphins learn and use to call to one another across distance. A dolphin can recognize a specific whistle belonging to another dolphin it hasn't heard in over 20 years. Statistically, a dolphin is more likely to respond to a distress signal from a socially bonded individual than from a stranger within its own species, which makes the willingness to protect an entirely different species even more remarkable, because it means the trigger response is stronger than the normal social filter that governs almost everything else in their behavior. That's not a small detail. That's the animal equivalent of a fire alarm so sensitive it overrides who is actually supposed to be saved. If distress alone can override species lines and social hierarchy at the same time, there is one final piece of this puzzle left, and it changes how you should think about every dolphin encounter you've ever seen online. So go back to that open water, that shape moving beneath you, the sound of your own heartbeat suddenly too loud in your ears. The dolphins circling you were never choosing you specifically, and once you accept that, the whole story flips. It was never really about humans at all. It was a switch built for one species that happened to misfire, generously in our direction. The uncomfortable part is that the same switch could just as easily fire for the wrong reasons, or fail to fire when it actually mattered, because it was never wired to know the difference between a person and a calf in the first place. That's a strange kind of comfort, being saved by an accident of instinct rather than a choice. Maybe the most human thing in the ocean was never a decision at all, just a mistake kind enough to look like one. If this kind of story is the reason you keep coming back to this channel, subscribing costs nothing and helps more than you'd expect. So hit like on your way out and tell me in the comments whether you'd still trust that instinct, knowing now that it was never really about you.